Hello and welcome to this video on the growing research integrity crisis. Researchers run into trouble over the last few years with the integrity of work done and published. This can largely be summarized by this tweet, which claims research should be activism. Unfortunately, activism inherently conflicts with the scientific method. Before looking at the problem, we should understand how the modern system we call the scientific method came about and what we do in science. Historically, science has looked at the big picture, identified a pattern of events that appear to be associated, then it dissects the series of events into cause and effect. It then tests the causes to see the effect. This creates a reliable model of our system. We now call these causes and effect the independent and dependent variables. For example, the sun rises in the east. We know it has risen in the east before now, and we are basically absolutely certain it will rise in the east tomorrow, just as it has every day before now. Even if you were to sacrifice a goat, the sun would still rise in the east tomorrow. What is important here is that in science, we attempt to clearly separate the cause and effect. We can describe our experimental variables with confidence. We know that we have relative control over what they are. This means that in a study, you should not have multiple independent variables influencing the dependent variable. This should also make the researcher absolutely objective in their evaluation of all the variables. We now have the ability to examine things on a minute scale, going down into the inner workings of a cell and the DNA. The modern day researcher is very different to what was in the early day. In the early days of research, the person conducting the study was largely independent of anything else. We now increasingly find that other factors such as research institutions, supervisors, funding bodies, and more influence the researcher's independence and objectivity. This is where design is important. Many designs fail to be replicated. A failure rate of up to 60% in published research and up to 75% in the lab. The replication problem has been described in a recent video. It adds into the context of this video about the integrity crisis. An anecdotal version of this involves a doctoral student who had been trying to replicate a methodology from another researcher for 6 months. They had put in many days, funds, and reagents trying to make it work, but to no avail. As they vented one day, it was casually mentioned to them that they should check to see if the paper they were using had been retracted, as every other avenue had failed. A few weeks later, they had found out their entire project was premised on a methodology from a retracted paper, and they had lost half a year, a large portion of the funding they had from their supervisor, and their self-esteem. Fortunately, they picked themselves up and finished their degree. For all of the issues in replication, there are mechanisms in place to address this. All of the problems the doctoral student experienced are meant to be identified, vindicated, or corrected by the peer review process. The problem is that the peer review process is showing holes, as the capacity to produce more research grows, but the ability to vet it remains relatively constant. Reviewers should examine methodologies, results, and statistics. They should poke holes in any problems found so that authors fix it. In a recent Twitter thread that you will find a link to, the reviewers did their job and received assurances from the authors that they would fix the published document. The authors did not fix it, and it went to publication with these oversights in there. This is just one example of the problem in publishing. The process for peer review is linked in the top right. Ultimately, the purity of the scientific method is presented as an ivory tower filled with scientists, isolated from the influence of the world. They are ideally pictured as non-compromising and self-correcting peoples that eventually expose all those who break the rules and correct the errors that follow. This is theoretically meant to address subsequent research and expose the academic misconduct of the original authors. This also means that reviewers and editors should be a good judge of the quality of research. This is demonstrated in one study of peer review efficacy, in which the researchers created a prediction market, a market in which each study included in this project had an inherent value. They took 80 researchers, who were mostly psychologists and economists, who read the studies and could then trade their share in the study's reliability. The predictions from these experts correlated with how well the original study results worked. Their overall replication rate was nearly identical. This result suggests that reviewers and editors should be good at evaluating the quality and ability of a study to replicate real-world conditions. Fundamentally, it is still powered by human minds, and therefore subject to error. All of these factors culminate in the current research integrity crisis: replication problems, peer review, and the isolation and internal nature of science. To address the first point in publishing, the open access model was seen as a solution to this situation, a method of publishing where researchers would invest in their submission financially, which would give them reason to ensure it was quality. The journals wouldn't have to charge subscription fees either. With their operating costs covered by submission fees, the content could be made available for free, and the research would therefore reach a broader market. A wider market should have greater exposure to other researchers who can identify problems. The audience can then report their concerns to the author and/or journal. This should have theoretically improved the quality of content submitted. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for nefarious publishers to recognize the opportunity to set up fake journals and start generating money from both junior researchers and those from developing countries. These people may lack the financial support, have language barriers, or not be as skilled in the area of publishing. These barriers may prevent them from publishing in an authentic journal and make these predators an appealing option. This problem is not just limited to developing nations, but there is a disproportionate representation in the statistics in certain groups. These authors may need to publish, and they may work with colleagues to get through the process of peer review. This is a practice that's generally frowned upon, and is exemplified by Springer, which retracted 107 papers from one of their journals. This was because the authors had been submitting papers, and they had been accepted after a fake peer review process. This was only discovered after additional screening from a prior round of retractions. This push to game the review process is fed by the publish or die mantra in research, which leads to the acquisition of competitive grants and funding. Grimes and colleagues constructed a model of how researchers fare when funding is awarded based on the number of papers published. This was in an effort to understand which factors shape the trustworthiness of published research. That issue of replication and review. This was a theoretical model which broke contributors into diligent, careless, and ethical groups, and then looked at how different behaviors gain or lose advantage under different variables. This is a reflection of the reality in UK grant funding, as the average age of the first award increases year on year, but the relative age of the completion of a doctoral degree does not. This leads to enormous pressures on researchers to publish findings and get funding this year, as they may not qualify next year. A reasonable person can see how this can shape bad behavior. Recently, the pressure to succeed and lead in science is made clear, and the difference between first to publish and second is often insurmountable, which leads to important ethical considerations, as seen with the CRISPR babies. Grimes and company considered how different biases could change behavior in their model. They found that journals would select dubious research when funding was scarce. Increased competition leads to more publishing of risque science in lieu of diligent research. This can lead to false positives as a common issue in specific fields of research. More disconcertingly than that, was unethical and careless researchers would be allocated more funding than their diligent counterparts. Another stream tweaked the bias towards only positive results, a problem that is often seen in journals now. The model showed that this made the problem with fraudulent and falsely positive research more pronounced, as it was likely to be rewarded. The time to publish adds to the impetus of publishing many articles with some sort of positive result, as they take a long time to reach the end of review. This needs to be in time for grant applications. Researchers have a bias toward publishing in popular journals which increases with experience and responsibility. This is associated with the probability of getting cited, which is generally higher, and increases with impact factor. This counts towards promotion, tenure, and funding. This is a system that trends towards encouraging questionable behavior at times, particularly mid-career researchers, who in turn favor certain journals, which creates a concentration of contributors. A hyper-competitive funding environment combined with pressure for academic career advancement can create the perfect cluster of events for malpractice. This gets in the way of the objectivity required for good reproducible science. This leads into the next problem with misconduct. The problems with research integrity are at times narrowly defined as those conducive to misconduct. Misconduct specifically covers the fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism of work. Fabrication is, as the name suggests, simply making the numbers, results, or outcomes from nothing. At least one study estimates 2% of researchers fabricate their data. This is a confidence range between 0.86 and 4.45% of researchers. As a case study, we have Haruko Obokata. In March 2014, he was involved as a lead author in publishing 2 high-profile papers in Nature, describing a method for converting adult stem cells in mice into pluripotent stem cells by means of a chemical process. Several weeks after the papers were published, researchers at the Riken Center, Japan's national research body, were unable to reproduce the results, and they accused Obokata, who was lead author on the paper, of misconduct. The journal that hosted it retracted both papers simultaneously after the matter was investigated. Riken found that Obokata had fabricated and falsified the data. Falsification is manipulating research data with the intent to give a false impression, including manipulation of images, removing outliers, or other inconvenient results, which changes, adds to, or omits the final result. This is exemplified by Wakefield, who omitted children who did not conform to his study's goals. Alarmingly, 13% of academics admit to knowledge of this. That is, 1 in 7 know that data is being gerrymandered. As an example, manipulating research data with the intent of giving a false impression includes manipulating images. Dr. Das is a poster child for exactly this. He is a red wine researcher with a focus on resveratrol. His own university conducted an investigation in response to a whistleblower and found that he fabricated data on 145 occasions, which went into 26 papers across 11 journals. His accusations particularly included alterations of blot images. Finally, there is one of the worst actions in academia: plagiarism. This is not the work of lazy students who think no one will notice if they slip up and forget to include quotation marks or a few references. There is an ongoing problem with plagiarism and how journals handle it. Most times, a well-evidenced case will lead to retraction, but in others, you get a case like that of Michael Beer from Johns Hopkins University. He is a geneticist, and his case involved analytical software and plagiarism. Beer claimed that large parts of his 2016 paper were taken, mildly reworded to make them less obviously plagiarized. The authors of a new paper then restated the exact same equations he used in his software, that their results were not particularly different to what he had found, and there were a raft of other problems. After 16 months and an external ethical review, the article in question was retracted. This only occurred in response to other reviewers in the same location as the original author, who all resigned en masse as an objection to how the journal originally handled the matter. An example of both misconduct and the pressure to publish is in the humanities, with the Sokal Fair and the Sokal Squared hoax being major examples. The Sokal Affair was also called the Sokal Hoax, and is a publishing sting by Alan Sokal. He submitted an article to Social Text as an experiment to test their intellectual rigor. It was testing whether or not an article would be published, even when he put a great deal of nonsense in it, if it sounded good and flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions. Sokal Squared is so named as it is a bigger version of the Sokal Affair. This was done by submitting nonsensical articles which meant the editors held beliefs. These authors began a 1-year program of study by immersing themselves in the fields. Lindsay, Bogosian, and Pluckrose took the approach that if the normal academic controls do not work, they can use something else. In this case, they used Poe's law. The gist of which is that without clear context, the most exaggerated of extreme views is impossible to distinguish from parody. These articles were accepted, and in some cases praised for their originality, ingenuity, and great scholarly work. In both cases, completely fictitious articles were published and believed through a failure of the review process. They were both published and irrevocably tainted research in those areas. Another is distorted statistics. Among the more egregious errors done in science is one called p-hacking. This is due to a focus on novel, positive results, or those that are statistically significant. This leads to a bias in the scientific publications for statistically significant results, favoring the hypothesis. The most common means of getting these is called p-hacking, which occurs when researchers collect or select data for statistical analysis until they get significance. This picture from the conversation explains the problem with p-hacking. Rather than follow the black text, a hacker will follow the red text, which allows them to jump from hypothesis to interpreting of analyses. This in turn allows them to go back to study design and begin from there with a specific end goal. that being the known statistically significant results. Although not common, it is also a pervasive underlying issue. You can see here the distribution of p-hacking from one text mining paper. They explored the possibility that results in both the abstract and results section demonstrated p-hacking. This does not mean all research is wrong. Let's say you were to flip a coin 100 times and assume a significance of 0.05, a standard measure. This means that anything above 0.05 is significant. It also means there is a 5% error rate in the coin flip. Science is similar, but you need to allow for the wider variance and current research problems. This leads to a prospective 40% failure rate in replicability. Finally, there is confirmation bias, which takes us back to the claim that research should be activism. One survey found that 64% of participants reported they had at least once failed to report results because they were not statistically significant, which is a form of cherry picking. That 42% had continued to collect more data after finding that their initial results were not statistically significant. 51% had reported an unexpected and significant finding as though it had been hypothesized from the start. This is known as hypothesizing after results are known. This leads to a problem in the opposite direction: funding. Financial conflicts of interest are a well-known source of bias in clinical biomedical research. Multi-million-dollar clinical trials require pre-testing for approval. There is an obvious pressure on the developers of the drugs and those running the trials to ensure that the drug not only succeeds and makes it to market, but also captures the attention of the practitioners and influences a decision to favor that drug over others, more so where they are certain that it is safe. In another instance, the editor of a leading psychiatric journal announced that he was stepping down after he published a paper about treatment for depression without disclosing his or that of 7 other authors' financial ties to the company that made it. Another we have is that activists who are either deliberately or retrospectively using their design to justify results that they were never intended for. Recently, this sort of argument was used by anti-vaxxers who claim that research showing the MMR vaccine is safe just proves that vaccines given before that create a catalyst for autism. Biases may also arise from many non-monetary reasons. This is generally out of a desire for notoriety or ideological belief. Seralini and Hay are researchers who are notorious for this. In response to this mess, we have COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, an organization working on methodologies and practices to minimize the issue of integrity. COPE is one of a number of organizations seeing a large rise in applications from journals who want a framework to publish confidently. They have a minimum criteria that journals are assessed against when they apply for membership. They also provide education, flowcharts, and more content on many issues raised in this video. These include the handling of misconduct, evaluating conflict of interest, addressing plagiarism, and what the peer review process should involve. This is a behemoth of a new framework, and will eventually get its own video. But in summary, it exists to try and address many of the issues that have been pointed out here. Publishing itself is not immune to problems, and an example from Taylor and Francis stands out. When Taylor and Francis changed the head editor of one of their journals, they found that the editorial board felt that they were doing this inappropriately due to the conflicts of interest the new head editor brought with them. One of the editors wrote this. This is a personal comment, not necessarily the position of the board. but I see this move by Taylor and Francis as symptomatic of the larger commercialization and industrialization of academic publishing. Since Taylor and Francis run thousands of journals, they are not particularly concerned about the fortunes of any one title. They also strangely fail, in my view, to understand the very peculiar nature of their business, that the product is very largely dependent on the labor and goodwill of many people who work for free and are not employed. Once this goodwill is lost, everything else is lost, other than the title of the publication." End quote. This has led to the resignation of that journal's editorial board, a situation not uncommon where editors feel a publisher has acted with impropriety. Their services are provided for free, but are also essential to the journal's operation. As is the case here, it can lead to long-term and substantial issues for a journal. In this particular case, the publisher was forced to shut it down in response to the backlash. Another example is the previously mentioned Dr. Das, who was the editor-in-chief of Antioxidants and Redox Signaling, a journal where he submitted his own work for publication. All of this is not to say you can account for everything because you may not be aware of everything. As this study demonstrates, it is important to note that scientists may not always know all the factors that could impact research outcomes. Sorg et al. In 2014 found that exposure to human male odor, but not female odor, induces pain inhibition and stress in mice. Failing to record the sexes of researchers conducting an experiment when trying to replicate their research could lead to a replicability issue, and therefore undermine the reproducibility of their study. What is done is to make the best of an otherwise unknown situation in most research, use the available literature, bridge the gaps, and ensure that what you find is consistent with what others have found. If you are a researcher examining data for your next research project or dissertation, it's up to you to verify the veracity of the study and the results that were produced. You must do your own investigation of the research team members, the study hypothesis, the sample population, who funded the research, and which institution hosted the study. Barring anything else, at least check for a retraction notice on the source of your methodology. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.